I've spent the last 10 years of my career working with companies that are looking to develop and upskill their finance and accounting people. At the same time, I help companies build their FP&A functions, build processes that help them streamline and scale, and otherwise get them to the next chapter of their lives. Always had this bug in me of, you know what, I want to do something on my own. I want to take charge of the direction of my life and my career. And I did improv comedy almost 20 years ago. I did it for about 3 years. And just before I did improv comedy, I did Toastmasters. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is just not advocating for themselves and thinking that the company or their manager or their director or somebody else is going to have their best interest in mind.
What do you think is the future of financial planning and analysis?
It is not enough to just understand technical skills. You must understand your industry. You must understand your company's strategy. You must understand what supply chain and marketing and sales looks like in your company. You also have to understand what's going on in the world and how it impacts the business or organization that you're working with. It's always been in my nature to say, well, whatever I believe is going to build me and build my character, even if it's uncomfortable, I need to address that. And I'll just leave everyone with this.
Who is Carl? What is your backstory? Where did you grow up? And if you can share any events that had a big impact on you and formed you as a person you are today.
I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit in the state of Michigan in the United States. I was there until I was about 18, then went to school, went to university at Michigan State in the state of Michigan, and then thereafter moved to Chicago. When I moved over to Chicago, I started at PwC, but what a lot of people don't realize is even though I am a CPA, I've never really been a public accountant. I was in a very niche advisory practice there focused on intellectual property. And it was during that time when I was working in intellectual property that I learned writing in a technical and legal way, valuation of businesses and of patents and trademarks and copyrights, advanced financial modeling, Microsoft Excel. And in a very short period of time, I got the experience and skills that I could really leverage in a whole lot of ways. And thereafter, when the recession in 2007, 2008, around that time period happened, I said, well, what's going to be busy in a recession? And I ended up going into distressed business consulting for turnarounds, restructurings, bankruptcy, and spent a handful of years over there before I started to take a look at my portfolio of work, my inventory of skills, and had conversation with some clients who said, Carl, you can go out and do this on your own. And so while I didn't have the confidence really at that time, I took a little bit of time off, did some world travel, took an inventory of who my clients were, what types of skills I had, what types of work I'd done, and then I positioned that to the next chapter of my career. And in terms of events that had a very big impact on my life, a few things. So one, maybe a little bit personally, was my father had the same job for probably nearly 50 years of his life. And one job, one place, one career. And the idea of doing that really made me question the structure of the work environment and the career trajectory. I was like, I just cannot imagine doing the same thing at the same company in the same sorts of ways. Granted, there will be an evolution of it, but for 4 or 5 decades. And I remember towards the end of it, he said, I enjoy what I do, but now I'm really just kind of keeping the eye on retirement. And that was years before he retired. And so I was like, well, I don't want to stay doing the same thing forever. And I don't want to get towards the end of my career and say, well, I'm only just doing this so I can get to, my pension or my retirement. I want to be able to have some flexibility throughout my life and be able to position for different careers and different employers and different geographies. And so that was really something, the combination of my father having one long career and focus mostly on retirement towards the end. But that really positioned me to think, well, how can I create greater flexibility? How can I take greater control of the direction of my career?
But you chose accounting, finance, economics, and then continued in that field. Was that your dream to become that? Did you plan your life around finance and economics and being an accountant? And
No.
advisor?
No.
Right?
When I first started in school, candidly, because my father was a physician, that's what I saw most of my life. And when I started in school, I started in a pre-professional science background with the intention of maybe I would go to medical school or maybe I would go to dental school or something of that nature. But very quickly on, I just did not resonate with that field of study. And within the first semester, within the first 4 months of starting university, I left the sciences. I'd always had an interest in business and what business meant in our daily lives, as well as just understanding business, but I didn't really know a whole lot about it, to be frank. And I took a look at the various majors at my university, and there was accounting, and there was finance, and there was economics, and there was supply chain management, and marketing, and human resources. And I said, well, of all of those different domains, the ones that I think make the most sense would probably be finance or accounting, just because finance and accounting are in everything business-wise. Very quickly on, I knew that I didn't really want to do accounting. That didn't really resonate with me, but finance really did. When I started taking the classes and meeting people at the university, talking to professors, exploring different job opportunities, it just became so obvious to me how many different pathways there were in finance, and I wouldn't be tied to one trajectory. I could possibly be, pivoting and moving around in different directions throughout my career.
So you said that you had changes in your career. One of the biggest change was that you decided to go on and do this on your own. What did you feel? Why did you decide that this is the time? And what were the things that interest you in a different career and being by yourself? So for people who want to do something like this, they're on the verge of, they just don't want to, they're stuck and want to pivot. Can you give us the blueprint?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And I'll take you back to around the time that I was 18 years old, maybe giving some of the backstory of, hey, I want to have greater control over the direction of my career in my interactions with my father and others. I started a guitar tutoring business when I was 17, 18 years old. So that was really my first true entrepreneurial venture. I put signs all over town. I had over 20, 25 students over that year. And I just always had this bug in me of, I want to do something on my own. I want to take charge of the direction of my life and my career. A few years after I started at PwC, our recession happened. The work dried up. My partner, who I was most closely aligned with, retired. And I was at a bit of a juncture of trying to decide, do I stay at the firm but go into a different group? Do I relocate to a different geography? I actually looked into relocating to Italy. That didn't work. But around that time, I said, I'm going to take a little bit of time off to recalibrate and figure out what it is that I want to do next. And the typical person is probably going to do that while they're still working. My attitude and my approach has always been, I want to create some mental and physical space to give myself that, chasm to think, to be mindful. And so I took 3-4 weeks off. I went down to Costa Rica. But prior to going down to Costa Rica, I had done an evaluation of saying, is this the time for me to go out on my own? My answer was no at that time. I said I didn't have the savings. I didn't have the income potential. I didn't have the network or the connections. I didn't have the skills or the competence. I didn't have the client experience. All of those various points of saying, am I ready to go out on my own and be successful with this? My answer to most of those questions were no. And so right before I went to Costa Rica, I did a bunch of interviews at target firms I wanted to work at. And while I was in Costa Rica, I got a job offer and I came back and that's what I did next. And over the next handful of years of working in turnaround and restructuring, I built my network. I saved my money, I built my income potential, I developed my skills, I improved my competence and my confidence. And when I got to that next bridge period of saying, okay, well, what's next? At that time, I actually had a number of clients who said, Carl, go out on your own. You can do this. You don't need a firm to be behind you. You've got everything that you need. And so combining their encouragement with do I have the skills? Yes. Do I have the competence? Yes. Do I have the confidence? Yes. Do I have the network? Do I have the community? Yes. Do I have the client experience? Yes. So making the contrast to earlier in the career where I asked those types of questions and my answers were almost all no, at that point in my career, most of my answers were yes. And when I ended up taking my ultimately a year-long sabbatical, I built the business while I was on sabbatical so that when I came back, I had a new trajectory to embark upon.
So you have to be quite self-aware, first of what are your skills at any given moment of time, and second, have a clarity of what you want for the future, right? So you had this clarity from early age, let's say. You said 18, 19, you wanted to have have the life you want, right? And you are planning for it. So these are the key
right.
moments,
And I would take it a step further and say, rather than self-awareness of what is your personal inventory, a self-awareness also of who are you in your mind, in your body, in your heart, in your values. So while we can talk all about skills and experience, that self-awareness of what makes you really nervous? What makes you insecure? What makes you very anxious? What are you really good at doing that nobody else can do? So that type of self-awareness paired with those inventories I just mentioned is absolutely vital.
Great that you made this clarification, because it's really very important to know yourself. Because going into an area where it's not your best area, it's not going to be as successful if you bet on your best qualities. So you're working with a lot of large corporations. I saw that your LinkedIn, the thousands, hundreds, okay, not thousands, but hundreds. And you work with many people. What are the top qualities that set successful people apart from everybody else?
It's an important question, and I think is sometimes overlooked for the wrong reasons. And I admittedly saw this incorrectly, I think, earlier in my career. If you were to turn the clocks back 15 years ago and talk to people who I worked with, they would say, how would you describe Carl? And a lot of them would say, oh, he's really smart. He knows how to do the technical work. And back in the day, that's what I thought everything was about, was just being really, really good at your job. That's vital. But those are table stakes. And in terms of getting to the middle of your career and into leadership, the expectation is not that you're going to be the doer. The expectation is that you can teach people and mentor people and develop people so that they can be the doers. And sometimes people, they take a look at my technical skills now and they say, wow, you really know how to do a lot. And I say, yeah, I actually don't do a whole lot of this anymore. Because when I go into companies, I'm elevating and developing them so that they can do it. So then it creates a bit of a gap of saying, okay, well, Carl, if you're not doing that technical work anymore, then what are you doing? To be really successful in your career, yes, you have to be a master of the domain early, of the technical domain. But eventually it is, how do you communicate? How do you lead? How do you manage? How do you inspire? How do you connect? How do you enable other people, teams, and companies to be the best that they can be? And what I think is a little bit tricky about that is it's very difficult to train people on that. Right, to train people in communication, I'm not sure how you would do that. Train them how to write emails better. I don't know that that's the truth. Teach them how to give better speeches. I don't know that that's the truth either. So that's why, Ani, to go back to the self-awareness of knowing where you are good, where you are strong, where you are weak, and where you need to exploit those strengths as well as improve on those weaknesses, I think are really important. And then one last point, I think that at all stages of career and personal growth, it's imperative to find good people to surround yourself with who can be your mentors, who can be your role models. One of the challenges I had earlier in my career is I looked at some people who were in senior leadership and I said, these are not the people I aspire to be like. But then there were other people in my life or in my firms where I said, this person right here, this is somebody who I look up to. What is it about them that I like? What is it about them that I admire? And how can I not copy, but how can I emulate and learn from what they do and what I love about them and translate into my interactions with other people who I do business with?
Absolutely. I completely relate to the thing you mentioned about being technically good. I'm the same in the beginning of my career. I thought that being technically good is everything I need. And I was doubling down and working. Everything was perfect. And I was not promoted. So I was thinking, what am I doing wrong? So this is when my journey started. I started asking, well, what is going on? I started asking bosses, mentors, well, what am I not doing right?
I think it's a familiar story.
It was good that
I think a lot of people struggle with that, where they say, I'm as good as I can possibly be. I'm delivering as well as I can, but they might not be moving beyond that technical side into the more intangibles of what companies and leaders and teams really care about and value.
My next question is very much related to that. We spoke about what are the top qualities that set people apart, and maybe started the topic of what are these pitfalls and things people should avoid.
I would be thoughtful about playing too much politics in a place of business. There is always going to be politics. And what I mean by that is, going beyond just the work of who you are connected with and what is it that you're doing for them and with them and on behalf of. You have to be very aware of your environment, but playing the games can really come back and haunt you. Something else that I think I made a mistake earlier in my career that I caution everybody to be aware of is nobody has greater responsibility for your career than you. Do not expect that if you are in a company or a firm with a big name, and I've worked with lots of blue chip companies, that just by doing what you're asked, you're going to get promoted and you're going to get great opportunities and the company is going to look out for you. Recognize that these big companies, these blue chip name companies that all of you have heard of before, they are not just a banner of a name and a brand. They are made up of people. And if you're going to be promoted and find the opportunities and jump onto the projects or engagements that you want, you have to fight for that. You cannot expect other people to read your mind, get into your heart, and think about what is it that you're so good at, and I'm going to give you all these opportunities. You have to advocate for yourself. And sometimes that means taking risks. Sometimes that means going in a direction that you didn't think that you were going to go in. Sometimes that means connecting with strangers. Sometimes that just means making sacrifices of moving away from the work that you're really good in to play along the fringes of new work that you want to explore. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make is just not advocating for themselves and thinking that the company or their manager or their director or somebody else is going to have their best interest in mind. Think about how you can overlap with what your best interests are with what is for the better interest of your team or your company.
I describe this as having a car and either being the driver or being driven. So if you want to do well in your career, you have to be the driver because you drive in the direction you want to go.
Absolutely.
Not in the direction that somebody else wants to go.
Absolutely.
So you were talking about the mindset, self-awareness, creativity, etc. But finance professionals, so much into money and numbers that they, I think, ignore these qualities of creativity, of connecting with people, etc. So how do you teach them to utilize these qualities to their benefit?
Well, even going back to our earlier discussion of when I studied finance versus accounting, I actually have my undergraduate degrees in finance and economics, and then I went and got my master's degree in accounting, believe it or not. But the reason why I did it that way was that accounting is, you're either doing it correctly or you're doing it incorrectly. There's not a whole lot of gray area in between. There's rules to follow. Whereas in finance, it's a whole lot of gray area. And while there is some right or wrong, a lot of it just comes down to interpretation. And so I joke around sometimes with clients, sometimes with groups, sometimes just one-on-one. And I say, look, almost every forecast that I've ever put together has been wrong, right? I'm predicting the future, which is inherently unknown, uncertain, and you can't be 100% right on that. But can you be 90% right? Could you be 80% right? Could you be 50% right? And if you hit those levels of confidence, does that mean that you can't move forward with a good decision? No, companies do it all over the world every day of every year. There is not that level of certainty, that 100% certainty that many humans want to get to say, oh, I need to be so confident to know that I can't fail in order to go forward. But when it comes to creativity and uncertainty, it's saying, look, what are the data points? What are all these data points telling me? Can I take some calculated risks, recognizing that there is a risk of mistakes, of failing, of getting this wrong, of screwing up over a year and having to backtrack? So I think that that's the reality that many finance, accounting, business people have to understand is you're surrounded by uncertainty. And every day of your life, you move forward not being 100% certain. And if you think you are, you're probably deceiving yourself. And the last point that I would make, Ani, is just because the world is what it is today, and we can take a look backwards on how we got here, doesn't mean that we have to follow everything that has already been done. And there was a professor at a Ivy League school I remember hearing was saying, you know what, I have a lot of investment banking and private equity focused MBAs in my program. That's what they all want to be doing. And they are the absolute best at what has already been done. And when he elaborated on that, he basically said, look, they are so smart at studying what currently exists. And he said, what I want them to be able to do is to look at the present day, envision what the future is, and to create something that doesn't yet exist for a future that doesn't yet exist. And that's bound to fail in many ways. But there are probably plenty of opportunities to succeed because there are not people and not professionals taking advantage of those opportunities and those voids.
So talking about what you just said, people knowing what is the current environment and anticipating what it might happen in the future. With all the changes that are happening with the economy, with the global order, with AI, etc., what do you think is the future of financial planning and analysis, and how do professionals should prepare for it?
So I can make predictions, but it's actually probably best for me to just say what the deficiencies and gaps are today. Because when I go into companies and they say, Carl, we have issues here, you can't advance into the future without addressing some of the major deficiencies that exist right now. One of the major deficiencies is, even going back to earlier our conversation, is we have people who were educated and trained in school or in their MBAs, and they are not positioned for this job. So the jobs that they are being educated for, their education is not preparing them for the jobs that they will have. That's a big problem. One of the reasons, at least when I was in school, that I had an issue with that was so many of my professors were academics and not real life practitioners. These were people who had spent 20, 30, 40 years in universities and academia and had spent maybe at the most a few years in corporate. My favorite professors were those that had spent 10, 15, 20 years in corporate or in consulting and then decided to go back into academia. So one of the big mistakes that I think we see, at least in education, is how can we get people educated for the jobs that they are going to be in? AI, very relevant right now. How are universities teaching students to embrace the technology and identify the parts of their brain that may be augmented or supplemented by AI and say, I'm going to learn this over here because I need to know this. But over here, I know that I can leverage the power of AI. I don't necessarily need to understand every inner working, but I need to be able to speak the language of it. In terms of the way that the world is changing, while I think that in decades past there was an increase towards globalization, and I don't think that that's going to go away, I do think that there's going to be a push and a pull of, are we going to be a truly globalized economy, or are we going to start to see more localization within the countries where we work, or more of an alliance with certain stable economies around the world? And then finally, I think another point that I would raise is, at least in FP&A and financial planning and analysis, going back to our discussions on technical, it is not enough to just understand technical skills. You must understand your industry. You must understand your company's strategy. You must understand what supply chain and marketing and sales looks like in your company. And you also have to understand what's going on in the world and how it impacts the business or organization that you're working with. So what I think I would summarize all of this together is, you need a much more well-rounded, holistic background and focus than one that's just focused on technical.
Totally, because you always have to put things in perspective. Otherwise numbers don't exist in isolation. They are all related to goods, people, and whatnot. Finance and the concept of finance as a service.
So what transpired a decade ago when I had clients who were saying, Carl, go do this on your own, is they said, well, as an outsider with certain expertise or competence in an industry or doing certain types of transactional work, they said, look, you don't need to be a full-time salaried employee at a business. You can come in on a part-time basis, do the work far more effectively and efficiently than a full-time CFO might be able to. And while it might be a little bit more expensive on an hourly basis, it actually costs the company a whole lot less, because I or other service providers are not working 50 hours a week for this company. And whether you're talking about a finance as a service from a consultant or a CFO advisor or a fractional FP&A person, the reality is, whether you're outside of a business or within one, business is a culmination of individual projects, initiatives, and engagements. It's not that, there are certain processes that are just ongoing all the time. Month-end close, tax filings, these are just always ongoing. But when you think about the strategic direction or growth of a business and what must get done, there are certain initiatives, certain projects that would take 6 months, 12 months, 18 months to get done. And rather than say, we're going to position our full-time people to do this, you can bring in some outsiders to help get that across the line, help develop, guide, and mentor the full-time people, and get that initiative to the finish line. And then at the same time, there's nothing to say that internal finance people are not advisors and financial services people themselves. Because if they are going from one initiative to another project to another engagement internally, to me, that's finance as a service. That's not just a full-time FP&A professional doing their job.
When I was looking at your LinkedIn profile and studied in the net things about you, I noticed that you've finished an Improv theater and you were a Toastmaster. Mm-hmm. How does this relate to finance? And how did this help you?
Yeah, so, to take a step back, I did improv comedy almost 20 years ago. I did it for about 3 years. And just before I did improv comedy, I did Toastmasters. And when people, oftentimes when I go into companies, they say, Carl, you really know how to speak. And I say, but let me tell you something. 20 years ago, the very first Toastmaster speech that I gave, which I think most people who know Toastmasters know, is called the icebreaker, where you get up in front of a group and you just talk about yourself. It's as easy as it can possibly be. But I remember I got up in front of the room and I had note cards of the key points that I wanted to remember, and I stumbled over my words and I was beet red and my face got totally full of sweat. And I totally crashed and burned. It was just not something that I was comfortable with. But it's always been in my nature to say, well, whatever I believe is going to build me and build my character, even if it's uncomfortable, I need to address that. because I don't want to get in front of people and be uncomfortable. I don't want to get in front of a high stakes engagement and crash and burn. So I took Toastmasters very seriously, and I said, I want to get the practice. I want to put the reps in. I want to get the feedback from other people in the room of, Carl, what is it that you're doing well, and what do you need to build upon? And I took that seriously. And then with improv comedy, that was just kind of a fluke, at least at the very beginning, where once I finished my CPA exam, I had a friend who was like, Carl, you should do improv. I do improv. It'll be fun for you. And I did it, and I hated it. But all of my friends who were in the team with me, they were all going on to the next level. And they said, Carl, you got to go on to the next level. I said, okay, well, I guess I will do that. And I did the next level, and I hated it. But then, this is the key point. I got to the third level, and I loved it. And the reason I loved it was for no other reason than the instructor. So when I talk about the importance of a good teacher, a good mentor, a good coach, a good person who can make all of the difference in the world, this was 6 months into my 3-year improv journey that I met somebody, they inspired me, and I continued to do it for 2.5 more years. And as a result of Toastmasters and improv and a TEDx talk, all of these things together, seeing what I'm good at, improving my communication skills, knowing what I'm not good at, and putting in the reps, what finance person can't benefit from being a better communicator, being able to write emails better, being able to get in front of a group and inspire and bring them together? That is so much more of what finance is communication and guidance and leadership than just being able to do the technical work.
Absolutely. And thanks you saying this. I do believe this 110%. And at the end of the day, no matter what you do and what AI you use and what computers and laptop you use, you're talking to a person on the other side of the line, even on the other side of the phone. When you read something, somebody wrote it, etc. So people forget that. We think that we work with technology. No, we work with people who created technology.
Right, and people who leverage the technology, but the technology is not the people, and the people are not the technology. At the end of the day, it's all people doing business with people.
So for those who are listening to your interesting stories, and I inspired the way you were inspired by your teacher in the Improv comedy theater, and they want to become a coach or business advisor just like you, what is your advice to them? What quality should they cultivate, and what's the road to?
Yeah, I'm going to make it easy here. This is what I say to young students. This is what I say to strangers who ask these sorts of questions. I say, go out there and find people who are doing what you want to do. Or go out there and look for people who have the qualities that are qualities that you want to develop too. And talk to them. Understand what their backstories are. Understand what it is that they did. Ani, as you and I just talked about in terms of communication skills, what did I do? I did Toastmasters. I did improv comedy. I got more into writing. There were all different types of steps that I took in order to do that. So anyone who's trying to get to a place that they say, I don't know how to get there, I don't know what that looks like, I don't know what the pathway is, try to identify people who are there, or try to find people who are one step ahead of you. Because even me, I'm 20 years ahead of somebody who's just starting out, and I might not remember those steps that I took 18, 19 years ago. But if that individual's saying, well, I want to do something similar to what I'm doing, I can connect them to somebody who's 15 years younger than me or 10 years younger than me, who's a little bit closer to that stage of growth and development that individual is looking for. So much of it has to do with trying to, not make mistakes, but to minimize the mistakes and make them smart mistakes. And a lot of that comes from identifying support networks, communities, and others who can help direct you in that way.
And these days, with all the networks like LinkedIn, a professional network, anyone can learn from so many people. There are 900 million people on LinkedIn alone. When I was growing up, there was no LinkedIn or a computer or any network. You had to go and ask somebody in person, can you help me with this? And now it's like you can get the help from anywhere. So you just have to do it.
But if you think back to it, Ani, and not having those resources, saying, well, I had to physically go up to somebody or call somebody, don't lose sight of that. Because if you go onto LinkedIn and say, oh, I can reach out to 900 million people, you can. But you have to be thoughtful in the same way that you would interact and respect them if you were talking to them on the phone or if you were meeting them for coffee. So I get contacted all the time by total strangers who just ask me for my time. And I'm like, look, I'm happy to be helpful, but you got to make this, work for me as well. And respect my time and my effort and what is that I can do to help you and how can you help me. That's how this happens.
No, that's very important. Absolutely. And let's finish the podcast with one last question about listeners who listen to you are stuck in their careers and they don't know what to do to get unstuck. What will be your advice to them?
I'll give a couple pieces. So I'd said earlier, and this is me knowing myself, is I have sometimes needed to take physical and mental time away in order to get the kind of clarity that I needed to get to the next place. I've shared with some people, I would sometimes even take vacation away from work, not to go on vacation, but just to create some space so that I can either be with myself or to work on some other things that I needed to do. At the same time, I think that it's important to be able to reflect on the environment that you are in, understand what is not working. Is it the type of work? Is it the people that you're working with or working for? Is it the industry that you're in? Is it the lifestyle that exists or that's required? It could be one, it could be many different things. So taking that type of an outside look in and saying, well, what is it that's not working? And can I fix this inside myself and inside the organization? Or do I need to leave? Those things are really important. And I'll just leave everyone with this. When I left one of my prior employers, I was called by one of the senior managing directors. And he said, Carl, what can we do to fix this? How can we get you to stay? Because I'd already put in my resignation. And I said, I don't think that there's anything at this point that can be done. I'm going to go do something different. And after I gave him that essentially finality of saying I'm done and there's nothing that can be done, he said, you know what? I just want to tell you that I respect you and I applaud you for recognizing that this is the right time for you to make this decision. Because a lot of people don't. A lot of people stay in it and then they end up destroying their personal lives, their marriages, the relationships they have within their families, or they end up getting into substance abuse or other types of very damaging behavior. So I would encourage people to really do that type of personal inventory and environmental inventory of saying, what is it that I see? What is it that I know? What is it that I feel? What needs to change? If it can change, make it happen. If it can't change, it's not worth sacrificing your life, your well-being, your health, and your personal relationships.
This was a great ending to the podcast. Thank you so much. It was very interesting talking to you. Thank you for all the insights, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Ani. Thanks for having me.
This is all for today. Thank you for being with me till the end. And before you go, I have a huge favor to ask. Would you please subscribe or leave a message and send us any comments and recommendations? The more we hear from you, the better this podcast will be. Thank you for now and see you in the next episode.